Okay, so ancient Christian church reveals mysterious 1600-year-old warning to non-believers. Only the righteous. Well, the accurate or the complete sentence or phrase that was above the church door that was discovered, 1600-year-old church, in present day Western Turkey was only those on a righteous path shall enter. Only those on a righteous path shall enter. Sounds like a Indiana Jones movie, but nonetheless, this was found in a little town called Lydia. Now, Lydia is near a church you may recognize from the book of Revelation called Laodicea. So, Laodicea and Lydia were in this very prosperous, very rich area of present day Western Turkey. Paul would have done some of his missionary journeys through that area. Laodicea was very wealthy. Laodicea was very prideful. Right? Laodicea had a world-renowned ophthalmology school for eyes. It had a world-renowned textile industry where it made purple linen. It also had a water system that was only lukewarm. So they had to buy their water from surrounding towns. It was only lukewarm. That's why when you go and you read Revelation chapter 3, Jesus is rebuking the Laodiceans and saying, you guys are stagnant. Part of that is because lukewarm water was like a stagnant kind of state, and it wasn't hot, wasn't cold, and it wasn't very palatable. So Jesus says, you guys are blind. If you know a little background of Laodicea that we're learning now, you see how Jesus uses their prideful belief in their wealth and their schools and their industry, and then uses sarcastically their water system to kind of analogize how they're stagnant in their faith. They're too prideful. The Laodiceans were so prideful that back in 60 AD, there was a major earthquake in that area where this church would have been present. They refused money and help from Rome, which Rome was actually the capital of that empire, still part of the Roman Empire. And they refused money and they fixed the city even more beautiful than when it was destroyed. And they had pride over that. So when you go back and read Revelation chapter 3 and Jesus' rebuke of the church of Laodicea, I hope that kind of gives you a little bit more richness in what Jesus is using their own pride against them in his rebuke. Well, this church would have been in that same area that Jesus is talking about. So why is this important? It's important because again, we're showing this time frame when Christianity has spread like wildfire, right? And now we're having these ornate churches, and this was a big church, by the way. They're still excavating it. And there is this definite belief on the deity of Jesus Christ, right? Not just a prophet, not just a great teacher, but he is the only way to God, the only way to salvation. And we're starting to see more and more churches excavated, right? 100 to 300 years after Jesus is crucified, buried, and resurrected, where this belief is starting to become more and more and more abundantly clear earlier and earlier in Christianity. So it wasn't something that was made up or something that was uh, codified, if you will, at the Council of Nicaea. No, that's wrong. That's not accurate. The deity of Jesus Christ was a creed, and we've seen that in Galatians, and we've seen that in 1 Corinthians 15. That was predominant belief before Nicaea, which happens in 325 AD, I think. So discoveries like this just help to augment, help to prove that not only was this the belief of really early Christians that we see in Jerusalem, i.e., the first apostles, Paul and his gang, but something that really was abundantly clear and believed in the early Christian church. So down there below on this screen, you'll see a reference to the site of Noah's Ark. We talked about that same exact discovery. I'm not sure why this article couples them together. So that picture that you see is not the church we're talking about. It's the actual anomaly that's in a mountain, again in present day Turkey. This is what's called the Durupinar site, which some archaeological experts believe is remnants of the Ark. I'm here to tell you that we talked about it. The consensus among most respected, peer-reviewed excavations and studies and articles is that this is just nothing but a natural anomaly or feature, geological feature. It's not the Ark, Noah's Ark. So you can read about that on Google or the internet. Okay, so fortunately, last week we talked about the bully that was discovered, a little wax seal that you see to put seals in wax that was discovered near Temple Mount, which is in Jerusalem. Um, Apparently, the Muslim administrate, well, the Israelis administrate it, the Muslims still have access and pretty much can rule who goes in, who goes out to their actual mosque there, which is right in center of the temple. There's been a little leeway now, a little wiggle room to allow Israeli, well, Jewish and Christian archaeological experts to get in there, which is good news because be prepared to see a lot more of these discoveries going on because Temple Mount has always been a rich source of this evidence. And now, hopefully, ironically, in this political setup, they seem to be getting a little more access now, which is good news, hopefully. Okay. Interpretation of the parables. We'll just continue on with this. Hopefully, we'll close it up and then get on to the book of Acts. But I just wanted to go ahead and reiterate this real quick. So, interpretation of the parables, those three books you see on the top of your screen, Craig Blomberg, David Wenham, and Professor Snodgrass. Um, those are probably three of the best sources that I think that I studied, that I've had other professors and experts tell me are really kind of the gold source, gold standard, if you will. And again, I showed these last week. Someone sent me an email. Would you please display these books again? There they are. These three books, along obviously with Scripture, with your Bible, are going to be great, great sources for helping you interpret the parables of Jesus. Whoops. So let's go on with this. A suggested sequence for interpreting the parables that you see there on your screen. And I think Dave was talking about this last week on a continuous allegory. And you're right, parable of the soils definitely fits into that category. So as you go through your study of the parables, this is kind of a good roadmap, kind of a good um, kind of tool to have for you to place your parables in certain subject matter so you can interpret it correctly. So continuous allegory, parable of the soils, of course, is the best example of that. The soils, the seed, the ground have corresponding meanings, and it should be a continuous practical application that we see. Um, and most points have corresponding meanings. Remember, we talked about the monadic, dyadic, and triadic characteristics of parables. Those pertain to the actual characters, human beings in the parable, not the actual inanimate objects. So we don't look at this as dyadic or monadic. This is more of a continuous allegory using analogy of soils and seed in the ground. A partial allegorical parable that you see right there, that's like the parable of the prodigal son. The father and the sons all have corresponding meanings. And last week, We talked about how in the late 19th century to probably about the World War II, middle of the 20th century, scholarly research, and even in churches and Bible studies, you would hear this push to find one meaning, right? One corresponding meaning in each parable. The pendulum has swung back, and now the consensus is to study, interpret parables with different meanings as Jesus intended. So, for example, when I first studied the parable of the prodigal son, I would always, like many of us did, especially as early Christians, would always focus on the prodigal son. Fair enough. However, now when we study it more richly, more deeply with hermeneutical skills, we see that the father and especially the older brother have incredible meanings in their own right. And the more I study it here's that word again, within the context of Jesus's kingdom building and his debates with the Sadducees, not so much the Sadducees, but with the Pharisees and the scribes. Now you start to see that the older brother, who represents that Pharisaical thinking, you kind of get more meaning out of what the older brother is doing and what he represents. So, again, that's just another good reason to know context. Grammar even comes in. We see that. We don't have time to really drill down on that. But historical and cultural references, right? A father would never run to his son in that culture. Never, ever, ever. And what we have here, we have the father running to the son, who, quite frankly, should have been cast out and completely written off. But the opposite happens. Obviously, the father represents God. Going on, a main point allegory. Main point allegory is the main thrust of the parable, has a corresponding meaning. Parable of the Good Samaritan. Okay, that's pretty much where you do focus in on the Good Samaritan. And good, of course, in quotes, given the contextual belief, the historical belief of a Samaritan in that society, or even for a Jew. And we'll get into that in about 5 minutes or so. However, you still can look at how the other people in the parable treat the guy in the ditch, and you start to also get some corresponding meanings there as well. But nonetheless, the main point is about the Good Samaritan. And then on the other end of the spectrum, realistic reporting, well, those are going to be just what you have in a Greco-Roman theological, biographical genre. Is going to be narratives. They're going to be factual, historical reporting, realistic reporting. So that's kind of the spectrum that you see on your parable. So use this along with identifying that one character, two character, or three human characters, and then the continuous, partial, and main point allegorical characteristics. And then there on point number two, another thing you should really consider is from the parable setting within Jesus's ministry and within the gospel structure. So always look to who the audience is that Jesus is talking to or teaching the parable. Also, look to who's listening in, right? And Luke likes to do that a lot when you read through his gospel. Luke will say, "Oh, and by the way, X was listening while Jesus was talking to Y," or Z was present while Jesus is talking to Y. And that's important because Luke likes to drop these little tidbits or crumbs to bring us to other points that he's trying to convey. Um, so, who is my neighbor? So Jesus is actually asking the question, I'm sorry, answering the question to Collins is on board, to a lawyer. to a scribe. So who is my neighbor? And that was a legal construct in that society. So my neighbor is a Jew, son of Abraham, by definition. And then Jesus turns it on its ear, and it's the Samaritan, right? Okay, so it addresses a concern, Jesus' relationship with sinners. It clarifies a new teaching. Remember, we talked about this expected kingdom form and the unexpected kingdom form. So Jesus has his work cut out for him. He's trying to clarify a new type of kingdom. That's why in some of the parables, Jesus will preface it by saying, this is how the kingdom works, or this is how the kingdom is. And of course, that's a big, big flag for you to say, oh my gosh, pay attention, because I'm going to get a new kingdom dynamic that's being taught here. And to a Jew in Jesus's audience, that was something that was almost unheard of or could not even be contemplated. We talked about that a lot already. And in line with that, so what Jesus is referring to as the mystery of the kingdom was not a shift from Israel to the church, but the surprising fact that the kingdom of God had arrived without applying the irresistible power many had expected. Military power, political power, David type power. He wasn't a line of David, was he not? So no, Jesus is teaching a new dynamic, a new kingdom. And then number three, be sensitive to historical and cultural features that heighten the parable's impact on its original hearers, Samaritans and Jews. Remember, Samaritans were considered half-breeds. Um, they were apostate. They were unclean. And in Mosaic law, to be unclean was a travesty. It's a sin. You couldn't touch them. You couldn't eat with them. You couldn't even get close to them. But in Jesus's ministry, what does Jesus do with some of the lepers? Touches them, hugs them. In that society, leprosy or Hansen's disease was considered highly, highly contagious, highly unclean, and you must have had some type of evil or huge sin befall you to get into that condition. So a Samaritan was pretty much even considered lower than the lepers. They polluted the bloodline of God's people and they committed idolatry. And they continued to commit idolatry time and time again. Again, most of the Jews were hypocritical because they were doing the same exact thing, especially during the time in the Old Testament. And then number four, determine the theological significance of the parable and draw applications that culturally parallel to the original listeners. So again, very, very important to study and to learn. Where is it? Um, these books. So interpreting the parables and read the Bible as literature. Those two books really help you with the cultural and historical Jewish belief and how they lived, their religious system, their cultural system, their dietary system. That helps you really get into the mindset of the early Jews who were in the audience of Jesus. Um, you see that come to a head. You see that come to a head with Peter and Paul in the book of Acts, and we'll talk about that. The dietary laws, um, the people who were becoming early Christians, who were Gentiles. There was a huge fight between Paul and Peter on that. And we'll see that when we get to the book of Acts. Okay, so additional parable hermeneutic tools. It's helpful to consider retelling the parable in modern garb. Um, I was once at a church, Southern California. Matter of fact, it was on campus where I was going to school, and the pastor there retold the parable of the Good Samaritan in what he called modern garb. So what he did was he used the man in the ditch. Instead of using the man in the ditch we have in scripture, he used an Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Okay. Anglo-Saxon Protestant gets down on his luck, gets beaten up, whatever, he's thrown in the ditch that we see in the Good Samaritan. The priest and Levite that walked to the other side of the street to avoid him, he uses two upstanding local pastors. And he had two of his friends there who were well-known pastors in Southern California. And of course, got chuckles out of that. Um, and then the Samaritan, he retells as a fundamentalist jihadi Muslim. Matter of fact, he used Osama bin Laden. And when you tell it in those terms, in that modern garb, it kind of get people attention. It's like, wait, how can that happen? That's the point. That's the point. I recall I had one teacher, one professor would say that the way that you would view Paul or how Paul's friends, right, how Paul's enemies, how Paul's co-Sanhedrin, co-Pharisee, co-religious friends, mentors would have looked at Paul would have been the same when he got converted, when Paul got converted, okay? Would have been the same type of dynamic of when Osama bin Laden, when he was holed up, found Jesus Christ, became a Christian, and goes out into the Muslim world from where he is from and started to profess the gospel. That's the same type of incredible change and the incredible evangelical mission that Paul was doing. So when you kind of put it in modern garb or retell or try to use those analogies, it really does demonstrate the power of the gospel and the power of Jesus and how he, right, actually influenced not only Paul, but people like Philip and his apostles. The seven deacons that we see, right, in the book of Acts. I mean, the first true, well, no, the second true Christian martyr, anyone know, in the book of Acts? He actually gives the longest speech in the book of Acts.
Stephen.
Stephen. Stephen.
Oh,
Right.
second, yeah.
Stephen. A Hellenistic, Stephen was Greek, Hellenistic. They had a completely different type of philosophical, theological, religious construct. For Paul and Stephen to actually have that type of incredible change, it's a God-given type of revelation. I mean, it has to be. So
Well, who was the Scott? Who was the first martyr? I thought Stephen was the first martyr.
Jesus, Jesus.
I agree with that.
We could split hairs. I mean, but yeah, Jesus. Um, and we're going to talk about Stephen. We're going to talk about Philip. And I know a lot of people, when we get into Acts, a lot of people mix up Philip with the Apostle Philip, one of Jesus's original 12 apostles, or the deacon Philip that we see in the book of Acts, who helps to evangelize to the Ethiopian eunuch. And we'll parse that out in hopefully in a couple of screens. So number two, after 2 millennia of domestication, the texts sometimes convey to modern readers the exact opposite of what Jesus originally intended. We talked about that. We drilled that down. And examples, the Good Samaritan and the unrighteous steward. Remember, sometimes we scratch our heads when we read the parable of the unrighteous steward. Is Jesus commending really kind of criminal activity or immoral activity, stealing? Um, no, not really. But remember the unexpected kingdom versus the expected kingdom. In the unexpected kingdom, that we as Christians have a 2020 lens to see that now we are living in a kingdom mandated by Jesus to go out and evangelize for the second coming, right? And Jesus has kind of given us some practical ways to use unrighteous wealth. Why? Because unrighteous wealth, stealing, using money for influence will happen in this unexpected kingdom that we already but not yet consummated. So Jesus has given us some really good practical ways to use lesser to greater, lesser to greater. And that's what's going on there when you read about the um, the unrighteous steward. Uh, and I'm going to get into some grammatical issues in a couple of minutes on that. But back to the Good Samaritan. Last week we had a discussion about this towards the end, and there was a not a debate, but also a reference that the denarii or denarius singular was about a day's wage, and that's true. So in the actual parable, there's two denarii. There's two denarii that is given to the innkeeper to help the guy in a ditch get better and have housing. And so the Good Samaritan gives two denarii. And it is about a day's wages in that society, in that culture at that time frame. I wanted to also add this because someone really, really hit me on this because I did make a comment, which I still do and hold by, that that would have meant several weeks, if not a month, of lodging for the guy who was saved and was actually helped by the Good Samaritan. Because archaeological evidence, and I should have disclosed this last week, but I forgot. Archaeological evidence has demonstrated that at that time period, in that culture, in that area of Judea, a typical room at an inn, a road inn, would have been about 1/32nd of one denarii a day. That would extrapolate to about 2 months of lodging for two denarii, or 3 or 4 weeks for lodging and food. So again, another important reason to know the cultural historical background of these parables because it really helps just really impact what or how far the Good Samaritan really is going, how much he's sacrificing to help this guy he doesn't know who was beaten into a ditch. So it is about 2 months of lodging in an inn in that economic scale that we see back then for those two denarii. Um, the unrighteous steward. So the unrighteous steward, what we see there is if you now we don't have to know Greek. We don't have to know Hebrew to read and study the Bible. Fortunately, I gave you guys a lot of sources, dictionaries, concordances, um, translation of Hebrew and Greek to English. Get it online. There's actually logos.com. Logos.com actually has a side by side set up to where you can do Greek, Hebrew, and English and read at the same time scripture. Logos.com. But anyway, when you go back and you look at the word shrewd in Greek and the way it's used in that sentence structure, you're going to find out that the correct Greek word is called phronimos. Now, phronimos has and excuse Luke is using that specific Greek word in that grammatical construct because what it does, it shows that it's a clever, intelligent, practical wisdom worldly affair way of managing resources. And in Aristotelian ethics, that means someone who exemplifies practical wisdom and virtuous behavior. Remember, a couple of weeks ago, Luke writes the most parables in his gospel. Luke is writing to a Greek audience. Greek culture would have understood a parable or allegory. They were taught that way. Socrates and Plato taught in that same type of manner. So what Luke is doing, he's using words, he's using type of grammatical constructs to show that Jesus is trying to show that this is not something that's criminal, but a way to use virtuous behavior by using unvirtuous mammon or ill-gotten wealth, but we can still use it in a way that makes it good. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, but that's what Jesus is trying to say, and that's why he uses that famous phrase, "sons of this age and sons of the light." Sons of this age and sons of the light. Why? Because the sons of the light, even though they see the light, they've received the light, they're going to be in the kingdom, they're still going to have to rub elbows with the sons of this age. And what better way to use the game that the sons of the light used, like the unrighteous steward did, and use that to get them to come to Christ, right? Because remember, in that parable of the unrighteous steward, the owner doesn't go back and try to get his money back from the people that the unrighteous steward let off. No, he kind of commends them. And some commentators, some biblical scholars will say or will opine that the owner represents God. Um, you can hermeneutically read that into that. But again, it's you got to fight fire with fire for the good. And we have to do that living in this unfallen kingdom that's here but not consummated yet. And that's the whole point of the unrighteous steward. No, Jesus is not saying go out and steal or go steal or fudge on your taxes. Read it carefully in context. And it's a way of going from lesser to greater. And then in Lazarus and the rich man, again, um, in that hierarchy that we have, a rich man would have always been named. He would also been identified specifically and particularly because a rich man, a name in that culture meant everything. It meant inheritance, it meant power, it meant prestige. There were so many names running around. James was a familiar name, Philip, and go on and on. But for a man of wealth, he was known by several names. And a poor man would not have been even identified a beggar, a dirty Samaritan, a dog, a half-breed. But what does Jesus do in that parable? He doesn't give the rich man a name, and he identifies the poor man by name, Lazarus. So again, that gives us more impact when we read it with our 21st century Western eyes. So again, it's all about context, culture, historical, and sometimes even grammatical constructs. They're going to help us to read, interpret parables. Um, there's a detailed hermeneutical interpretation of the Good Samaritan. We talked a lot about that. All right, here we go. So finally, before I segue a transition into the Acts and Epistles genre, any questions, comments, observations on parables or gospels? Okay. So, yeah, the book of Acts, in and of itself, is a specific genre that we can study with certain characteristics, mostly historical, And it reads like a history book. So it's a historical narrative of the early church from AD 33 to about AD 62 or 63, thereabouts. Now there are some debates that are ongoing that Jesus died in 30 AD, not 33 AD. That is a tertiary type of problem to worry about. It's not a primary, it's not dogmatic, it's not doctrinal. Nonetheless, there are many, many books, if not hundreds of books, written about the timeline of Jesus' death. The majority of biblical scholars will go with 33 AD. 33 AD. The main reason for that is science, is astronomy. When NASA pretty much can figure out when Passover would have been, some type of constellation set up at a time frame that would have been happening in 33. Jesus would have died during Passover in 33 AD, not 30 AD. There's debate on that, but nonetheless, I go with 33 AD. I was taught 33 AD. But if you want to read about the differences, just Google it. But we'll use 33 AD. So Jesus dies 33 AD. That's when the book of Acts starts, and that it ends in about 62, 63 AD. Um, a lot of people think that Luke will disclose or talk about Paul's death. No, Paul died later. Anyone know about when Paul probably died in Rome, martyred in Rome? So we think about 67, 68 AD, thereabouts. Um, Now, Titus and Second Timothy were written 33, 34 AD. So we get some sense of timing from there. Um, what's a really interesting fact, and when we get into the epistles, we'll talk about this a lot more. We all focus in on the Gospels, of course, when we study, when we read the New Testament. And the epistles kind of get second calling, especially for a new Christian, and for good reason. I mean, really delve into the lifetimes of Jesus in the gospel, and then obviously go into the epistles. But ironically, most of the epistles were written before the gospels were written. As a matter of fact, we think Galatians was written probably in the late 40s, 48, 49 AD. Think about that. Way before even Mark probably wrote his gospel.
Hey, Scott,
Yeah.
just to clarify, a little bit earlier you said Titus and First Timothy were written in 33. Did you mean closer,
No, no,
close?
no, 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 no. Early 60s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
you had said 33, and I didn't
I,
think they'd be written so close
I
to
was
Christ.
I was probably fixated on 33. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
That would have been miraculous, right?
All right. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So we're gonna go. I'm excited to show you guys this. I'll give you a little tease. And we'll finish with this. You're gonna want to screenshot that, and I got permission to use it from one of my professors. So you guys are going to have a really unique way of studying Acts. So let's get through this. So that little blurb, a box that you see on your screen, the Bible books of the epistles, obviously Romans to Jude. Okay, that timeline, I stand corrected on that. That timeline says 40 to 95 AD. Okay. Well, it should have been 40s. I forgot to put the apostrophe S. I know I'm gonna get excoriated on this. Present day scholarly research does tell us that Galatians was probably written 48, probably 49 AD, not 40 AD. So I need to fix that. 49 to 95 AD is for the epistles. A lot of them before the Gospels. What is an epistle before we launch into Acts? An epistle is simply just a letter. It's a letter. Um, but more importantly, it's also what's called a situational document. A situational document. What is a situational document, Scott? Um, and here's what Paul is mostly doing. Paul, of course, wrote most of the epistles. It describes so Paul is describing a current state of specific situations, right? Um, Kind of like a newspaper reporter who goes out and studies and investigates and comes back and reports. And then actually sometimes will editorialize on what's going on. Paul's doing a lot of that by design. It provides a context and background to help understand a problem, an opportunity, or a challenge. And we see a lot of that in Galatians. I mean, Galatians, Paul is really rebuking a lot. He's warning, and people have called Galatians the polemic book of Romans. Mm, I kind of like that description because it really is true. Because what's happening is that in the early church, it's getting attacked and it's getting prosecuted, and there's a lot of false teaching going on. And we see that in Laodicea, and Jesus even has to come onto the scene post ascension to rebuke Laodicea for this exact problem going on. So, for example, what prompted Paul to write to the Galatians? And when you go through the epistles, and we'll talk about that later on, that's one big thing that we should do as we read and try to interpret and study the epistles is what is prompting Paul to write that specific epistle? And in the book of Galatians is to oppose the false teaching of Judaizers. That was a big, big problem. And that comes to a head with Paul and Peter in I think Acts chapter 10 or 11, or maybe, yeah, 10 or 11, I think. And they split. They split because of the Judaizers. So what is that, Scott? So back in that culture at that time, that would have been a Jewish Christian. Now, this is kind of hard to follow. It would have been a Jewish Christian who insisted that Gentile converts must adopt Jewish customs and laws to be considered a true Christian. Do you get that? A Jewish Christian who insisted that Gentile converts must adopt Jewish customs and laws to be a true Christian. That was a big issue, a big problem in the early church. And when you understand that dynamic going on, it's going to help you navigate through the book of Acts and really see, and the epistles as well, of this really bad problem that's going on in the early church. Think about this. We're talking about a peoples who were under Mosaic law, under Jewish custom and religion, under the sons of God, God's chosen people, for thousands of years. And then all of a sudden, there's this new type of kingdom. There's this new covenant that comes in. It's going to take a while. It's going to take a while for that transition. And that's what we see. And Paul, when you read with that kind of mindset in his epistles, you'll see Paul get angry and you'll see Paul get frustrated because the poor guy he's trying to go through a pagan culture. In some sense, the Gentiles and the pagans were easier to convert than the Jews for reasons we talked about. So Paul's work is cut out for him. So if you have that type of cultural mindset, you'll really understand what's going on, and especially in Galatians and Thessalonians 1 and 2. All right, Book of Acts. Why is the book of Acts so important? Because not because it shows us the early workings and the early setup and the birth of the early church, but it also provides us with this incredible, rich, historical, accurate historical survey of the early church and how Christianity spread through a pagan empire. So right there on your screen, Sir William Ramsay. We have talked about Sir Ramsay a lot in our archaeological presentations and references. Sir William Ramsay was probably at the time of his most renown, was the best, if not most academic, revered archaeological expert in the world. He was Scottish, went to Oxford, was with the Royal Society of Archaeological experts. He died in 1939. He actually went into the areas that we have been the promised land, right? Judea, the Holy Land, the ancient Near East. Um, he was actually raised and studied in a school or schools that taught the Bible was unreliable, especially the New Testament. It was not a reliable document. It was not a reliable source. It was mostly myth, legend, made up. And he had that type of mindset when he went out to study and survey archaeological sites in present day Israel, Jordan, Syria, the ancient Near East. What he came back with was a resolve that not only was he becoming a devout Christian, but also to prove that especially the book of Acts and the Gospel of Luke were authentic, right? Accurate documents. And he uses his history and he uses archaeological findings to augment and prove that. And these are two of his best quotes that kind of summarize this new mindset that he actually came to believe. So Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect to its trustworthiness. And when you read through the book of Acts, and for that matter, even the Gospel of Luke, especially in the book of Acts, you're going to see Luke specifically references political figures, places, events that at first were considered to be just made up, mythicized. But Ramsey is the first expert to come in and actually show no, no, this political figure existed at this time. This place really did exist at the time Luke places it there. Um, I think 2 weeks ago, or maybe last week, we actually learned that in, where is that reference? It's in Acts chapter 19. Acts chapter 19, Luke, who a majority of scholars believe wrote the book of Acts. Okay, so I need to preface that. Luke records in Acts chapter 19 that there were two, right? There were two proconsuls in an area where a riot had occurred. Tacitus, the famous Roman historian, oh, and by the way, there would only be one prefect, one Praetorian guard, um, one type of proconsul in these Roman outposts. This would have been like present day Antioch or North Antioch. But in this instance, Luke says too, we learn from Tacitus that there was this one specific time in history in that area where two proconsuls were sent by Caesar to help quell the riots. So, um, some other scholars have said, oh, Luke got it wrong. There were never two proconsuls or prefects at that one specific time that Luke records there was. Ramsey actually wrote a book and says, amongst other examples, that Luke is telegraphing to us today, future readers. He knows what he's talking about. And sometimes he would throw in these little arcane, insignificant incidents that weren't doctrinally or dogmatically important to kind of say, hey guys, when you read this 2,000 years later and do your homework and research, I threw this in here just to show that I know what's going on. I report the facts as they happen, right? And it's accurate. And we see many, many, many more examples of that that we don't have time to get into. And then finally, on the bottom there, it says Luke, Ramsey said this, Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, this author should be placed along the very greatest of historians. Um, all right, we got 5 minutes left. We'll go back to this next week. All right, this is a timeline, and I'll give you enough time to do screenshots on it. there's going to be 3 pages. This is a timeline of the book of Acts, and it's compiled by one of the most respected New Testament scholars, specifically in the book of Acts. He did his dissertation on it. Some of you guys may know him, or knew him. He died about 4 years ago of a heart attack while he was jogging. Dr. Harold Horner, I actually was able to meet him at a conference years ago when I first became a Christian. I didn't know who he was, but the guy was dynamic. Dr. Harold Horner was a professor of New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. This was his hobby. Dr. Horner did this as a hobby, and he spent 7 to 8 years researching this. And if you just peruse through that, he goes from the crucifixion, through the crucifixion, all the way to the destruction of Jerusalem in September 2nd, AD 70. So let's go back so you guys can. So he goes from the crucifixion. Dr. Horner actually found Friday, April 3rd, AD 33 as the date that Jesus, our Lord, died. And if you can see right there, I know there's a lot to consume here. He'll give you these events that mostly are going to happen in the book of Acts. And he'll actually give you the time stamp, or at least summer 35, autumn 37. Take this to the bank, folks. This has been picked apart by many, many scholars, and it's still considered the gold standard in most seminaries, in most academic circles, on a correct timeline that we see mostly in the book of Acts. And it's incredible. Um, I spent I spent weeks and months just poring over this, but we got 2 minutes left. So let me put up the second page so you can screenshot it or take a picture of it. I wish I could send it to you guys, but nonetheless, it's right here. This is the second page that continues on. This is going to be an invaluable tool to help you go through the book of Acts. Um, it helped me tremendously having this. Remember when we studied the genre of the Gospels? And I was teaching that it's important to keep a timeline of when Jesus' ministry, the timeline of his ministry, the timeline of events going on in the Gospels. Well, here you go, guys. This is minute. It's incredibly precise. Um, so I got that second page. Can I go on to the third
I've
page?
got these screenshotted in a Word document, so I'll go ahead and send them out after the class.
And here's the third page. Third page. Um, so down towards the bottom. So what Dr. Herner did, he underlined when the epistles that are referenced, and he underlines those so you can quickly see. So 1 Timothy written about autumn 62, and then down toward the bottom, Titus written about, oh, I said 63, sorry. Titus written summer 66. Titus written summer 6, and we think that is the last letter that was written before Paul is martyred.
The second Timothy.
Um, Getting back, I'll close with this real quick. So what's really important to flesh out with that early creed that we see in 1 Corinthians 15 is the timeline. So up there on top, you see that Stephen is martyred. Stephen is martyred in April AD 35. And of course, he does that incredible soliloquy, incredible speech to the Sanhedrin that gets him stoned to death. And in many ways, you're going to see a parallel. You're going to see him emulate He's in the same spot where Jesus was tried. He's in the same spot that Jesus was tried. Saul is sitting probably on a periphery, probably where Stephen threw down his cloak, watching Stephen get stoned. Yeah, the same St. Paul. Okay. But Paul's conversion, so real quick, I'll close with this. Paul's conversion, you see there, summer 1935, summer AD 35. Then we have Paul in Jerusalem in summer 37. All right. About 2 years later, if not sooner, but I'm going with Dr. Horner. In those 2 years, that creed that Jesus is Lord, Jesus is God, right, is already cemented in. And right there, we used the book of Galatians and the book of Acts. We put it together. We actually went through this months ago. We'll do it again next week. Paul goes from that executor of Christians, watching Stephen and probably grinning, Stephen gets stoned, to in Jerusalem, right? Meeting with the other apostles, developing, getting the creed that Jesus indeed is Lord and God. What an incredible, incredible short time frame. So not only do we have the creed being established or at least demonstrating these early churches were finding, we have now evidence that this creed was already starting to be promulgated within 2 years or within several years after Jesus' crucifixion. What what an incredible, incredible thing to know and to really teach to other people. So we'll go more into this next week because I'm telling you guys, you're going to have fun with this. And it's going to really help you go through the book of Acts. I mean, I read it, reread it with this, and oh my gosh, does it really give you a great roadmap? And Dr. Horner, thank you. He's with our Lord right now. He's written some other books. Google his name, and I highly recommend those books. Okay, 9:32, last minute, one or two questions, observations before we go. Okay, so praying for you guys. Oh, please pray for the
Scott,
Christian. Huh? Yes,
Scott,
sir.
you know where it says that, and this is because we keep talking about all this archaeology and all this stuff, but
Yeah, I think he got cut off. So
Ward
someone
went
was,
mute.
He
He
muted.
muted himself.
I'm sorry.
that's okay.
It said that God held the earth in nothing, and all the world's religions thought the earth was on top of a hurdle that was on top of something else, and all
Yeah.
this mysticism. And if you read that stuff,
Book of
and it was
Job.
so anti, because remember, long before we ever didn't think the world was flat, the concept of the earth was suspended in nothing was a serious scientific breakthrough written in the Bible.
Yes,
You
I
know what
think
I'm talking about?
it's the Book of Job. I actually do a presentation on that, and I actually show how the constellations that God tells Job that He created and the way they move. I think we talked about this maybe last year. I'll do it again. How the Hubble telescope and the Kepler telescope have now proven the way that God says those constellations would move actually moved that way and could not have been known when the book of Job. Remember, most scholars think the book of Job is probably one of the earliest, if not the earliest, even before Genesis.